I really said I am wearing blush today. Ooh. Hello loves, my name is Wendy Weather. I am the History Drag Queen, and welcome back to Spooky History, where this year we are talking about the history of horror. And in this episode, we are discussing the history of horror film and cinema. That's why I went kind of like classic Hollywood glam with my makeup today. I did a lots of blush and classic red lip. And what more apropos outfit to wear for this episode being the classic spooky history uniform dress. Like, y'all storm clouds who've been here, you know, through my entire social media journey, y'all didn't think I was just not going to wear this dress this year? That's crazy. Anyway, let's get into the history of horror cinema. So cinema really did not emerge until around the 1890s-ish, because the Lumiere brothers invent the cinematograph, as well as Thomas Edison tries to be a monopoly guy and have vertical production over all movie and cinema like things. We don't like Thomas Edison here. Just fair warning. But in the mid-1890s, a filmmaker by the name of Georges Méliès kind of emerges. If I were to categorize anybody as like the father of like horror cinema, I'm probably going to say Georges Méliès. Those of you who don't know, I actually have a film degree. And I studied Méliès in college, and he kind of is a pioneer of pretty much anything spooky ooky going on camera. And he actually kind of is the founder and creator of what's called mise en scène. Specifically in the like cinema sphere. It is when you use light and darks to create contrast and an atmospheric kind of vibe, in layman's terms. And one of like the very first like horror spooky like things on camera was Méliès' Le Manoir du Diable, which is basically, it's translated as House of the Devil. And it has, you know, all things like spooky ooky in it, kind of classically like cauldrons, spooky skeletons, bats, and of course, you know, Mr. Lucifer. He also is the creator of one of the like most old school, like iconic black and white, like scary cinema movies called The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. If you haven't seen Dr. Caligari, I would very much recommend it. I think it might be on like Vimeo or somewhere. Or it's gonna be like on like a DVD or something. But I believe Dr. Caligari comes out in 1920 or 20-ish. There are several like other horror movies that come out between the 1900s and 1920. A couple of supernatural type of movies. And then, of course, Dr. Caligari happens. But then we see filmmakers start to get not like low on juice, but start to kind of look to other places of try to create cinema. And then we see kind of a shift in filmmaking in the 30s because of silent films being split in the middle by talkies. Because those who are not familiar with film history, films prior from like 1920 didn't have sound. Sound was usually kind of ADR'd in afterward with like special effects or music. There was no audio in films prior to like the 30s. And during this time we actually see filmmakers draw kind of inspiration from classic literature, which is why we get film adaptations of like Frankenstein, Nosferatu from Bram Stoker's Dracula, and other kind of gothic like literature tales. The next wave of horror cinema actually doesn't come about until like the 1940s and 50s, because in the 30s something happens called the Great Depression. Was something like that, spooky ooky films really are not like the priority, you know what I mean? Like it's, yeah. In the 1940s and 50s, we actually kind of change into this kind of like creature feature type of vibe, because there is a theme that on the world stage of history that's actually occurring at this moment, and that is the fear of nuclear kind of war. And that is where we get kind of the golden era of sci-fi horror and like creature features and things like that, where things weren't like supernaturally, they become more like natural radioactive type of science-y horror. For example, we get like The Shrinking Man, Godzilla, things like that. And with that, we also have kind of like this fear of invasion happening, which is where we get Worlds Collide and War of the Worlds in, I think it was, War of the Worlds was in 53, I think? It was either in 52 or 53. And people freaked out. Because the infusion with radio kind of became like this super popular thing from the 30s to the 50s. Because that's where a lot of people got most of their information, because theaters were not very well prevalent in some communities, as well as TVs were not a thing yet. They weren't a thing yet. And so when radio happens, a lot of these horror stories are told over the radio. One of them being classically War of the Worlds, which is kind of like an alien invasion type of moment, and people freaked out because people who were just like scrolling through the radio, where they get their news for the most part, and they just, you know, are scrolling through and they hear War of the Worlds being played, they think an alien invasion is happening. There were some communities that were like freaking out. They went into their shelters and like, it was not great. And after the 40s and 50s, we kind of step into kind of more of a classic like psychological and slasher type of themes that are emerging in horror cinema. Mostly, just for example, the legendary Alfred Hitchcock. I mean, Hitchcock movies. I mean, you can't talk about horror cinema without even mentioning Alfred Hitchcock. Like, come on. Psycho pretty much created the entire, like, slasher genre. Like, come on. We also see Hitchcock kind of establish psychological horror and thrillers during this time as well. So, I know we're going a little fast here, so to briefly recap just kind of the roller coaster we've been on. Horror cinema kind of starts off in the 1900s with some supernatural type of vibes, and then we go into using Gothic literature as our like medium of making horror cinema, and then we go and we're up in this weird kind of sci-fi horror, and then we are now into this psychological slasher type of vibe, and baby, at least in America, ate it up. Oh, we were eating it up. But in the 70s, we start to see a return of supernatural elements that horror cinema kind of started with. And mostly because of like a couple films in the 70s that use occult and things like that. The Exorcist and The Omen are probably two like kind of flagship ones. That kind of introduce like the supernatural element of the 70s. And like the use of demons and demonic and spooky ooky ghosty things. And we also see this emerge in the early 80s, in 82, with Poltergeist. But the supernatural kind of horror cinema became a little bit of a subgenre in that era, because in the 80s, it was mostly about the slasher films. If you wanted to make a horror movie, baby, it needed to be some type of form of slasher, a crazy man, mostly, going around killing a bunch of very socially and, like, conventionally attractive teens. And the blueprint from that, I think, is probably, what was the first one that was way back in the 70s? Probably TCM. Texas Chainsaw Massacre probably is the one that kind of set up that entire genre. And during the 80s, we get kind of the classic slasher franchises are born, which becomes like the first thing that happens in horror cinema of horror movies getting sequels and like doing sequels in horror. Like that really wasn't a thing up until the 80s. And that is where we get iconic franchises like Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street. I think Child's Play was also in the 80s. Like, it just keeps going and going. But Child's Play, like, led into the 90s, which is a great segue. And then in the 90s, we actually see kind of like an attempt of a revival of an older theme, the creature features. Because CGI becomes a new technology in the cinematic sphere, and they try to use that to make these crazy creatures and monsters. One of them to note was, what was that one, that Betty White curses in? Lake Placid with the huge alligator. We hadn't seen like creature movies like this since there was a small blip in the 70s during that whole like supernatural element of where Jaws, like a crazy creature horror like Jaws. We didn't see that since the 70s. And so there was a couple movies that tried to revive that type of genre. The ones that I can remember, I think like Anaconda, Lake Placid. There were a couple other ones. Was The Deep filmed in the 90s or was it the 80s? I forget. But there's a lot of different, mostly weirdly aquatic creatures. I'm just now realizing that. Strange. And in the 90s, we actually see an individual come to like full evolution power. That individual is Wes Craven. I'm sorry, I'm a Wes head, I'm a slasher girly, I'm sorry. Ooh. He makes the Scream franchise, which kind of takes the slasher and kind of flip it on its head of making it kind of like satire-y but comedic and a little bit like there's kind of like reading his own self, but it blew up. Like it literally changed the entire like horror slasher type of topography. Like it changed everything. Where now slasher movies and stuff like that are self-aware, which I think is crazy. And where like all the characters that are in like kind of modern day slasher films are like, they look at the situation like, oh, we are in a slasher movie, got it. So this is what we all do, you know. It's so meta, it's so funny to me. I don't know why, it's just great. And then we get to the 2000s. Now this is just coming from like personal opinion because I was here. I think in the 2000s, I think maybe arguably, for some weird reason, we like as like horror movie and cinema goes, we were weirdly obsessed with like zombies. And is that just me, or do other people like, if you're looking back, kind of realize that? I don't know what we were doing in the 2000s, why we were obsessed with zombies. I don't know what we were doing, but that's what was going on. Because we have like Resident Evil, Dawn of the Dead, Land of the Dead, Zombieland, World War Z. Like, why were we obsessed with like zombie movies in the 2000s? Oh, and then the iconic I Am Legend. Like, why were we just all about zombies? The Walking Dead rises to fame? Like, what? That's so interesting. Like, when I was looking back in horror cinema and stuff for this video specifically, I noticed a weirdness in the 2000s of like, oh, we were zombie girlies then. That's what that was about. Okay. And then now it's the 2010s. And if you've been here for the past 15-ish years and watched horror movies, probably you would say, with me, we see a new rise of a subgenre that we saw previously in the 70s and in the beginning of horror, supernatural elements. I don't know why, but every time I turned around when I was in college or anywhere else, a new spooky ghost movie was happening, of where it's The Conjuring or something of that nature, where it is a demon and like spooky ooky spirits. I am not about it. Movies like that freak me out. Like, I can't do supernatural horror movies. I can't. And so every time I saw one, Ouija, anytime I saw one, I was like, why can't we just like make like other horror movies that weren't like ghosties? Oh gosh. And that brings us to today, the 2020s. If you're watching this in 2020, if you're watching it in 2030, hey, it's odd. Anyway, but the 2020s, if I were to categorize it, I probably would say we see kind of a rise in this psychological horror. I'm probably gonna say mostly because of, I would say like M. Night and Peele, right? I feel like that's a solid like answer. What do you think? Put in the comments below, what kind of genre of horror are we mostly seeing in cinemas right now? And that pretty much is the rest of this video. Honestly, this video was kind of more of an overarching type of look at the cinema history of horror. Not like an in-depth one, because if it was an in-depth one, I would be here for 2 hours. I love you guys, but that's a lot. Anyway, put in the comments below, do you have a favorite subgenre of horror? Or of the themes that I have discussed historically, which one do you think you would have loved to like be one of like the theater goers in? Like, do you want to be one of the OG like 1920s like Supernatural and like Dr. Caligari type of moviegoers? Or would you have loved to be in the movies in like the 70s and like seeing Jaws and like those old school supernatural horrors? Like, put in the comments below. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and stick around because you might learn something.